Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing the Thunder Junction gameplay level up episode. So, in the past 4 or so weeks the set's been out, we've done a lot covering the set on the show. We've done archetypes, big picture stuff, we've done individual cards, but most of that stuff is just in the context of where you should be drafting these cards and how you're thinking about archetypes. Gameplay, like I always say on these episodes, is classically a lot harder to cover in content. Generally, it's just a bit more fuzzy. It's a bit trickier to nail down these points. It's not just like, this card's good, this card's not. It's a little more nuanced. So like to give a little bit of breathing room for people to kind of get a feel for the format before we jump into some gameplay tips. But we're going to do that today. Limited is half about the draft, half about the gameplay. You could even argue that it's more about the gameplay than the draft. I do think being good at gameplay is super, super important to success in any format. So we're going to try to tackle that today. The way these episodes go generally is we'll start with some big picture points, some framing ideas for how I'm thinking about the games, for just the general cadence of the games, how the games tend to play out, and what you should be thinking about. And then we're going to get into some individual cards, getting a little more nitty-gritty, talking about, well, this card, this is how you want to play it, this is how you want to optimize it, this is how you want to play around these kind of cards, this is how you think about this kind of card. So as per usual, like we do on the show, we'll be starting broad and then narrowing in as we get on. So let's jump into it. All right, so let's get into those big picture points first. And the way I described these kind of big picture, how to think about the game points in previous episodes like this, is thinking about them as individual puzzles, where a new format, whatever format you're playing, the puzzle pieces are the cards, right? Every format's going to be a little bit different. Every format's going to have different puzzle pieces to work with. And the way that the cards tend to interact, there's certain patterns that get formed. You can kind of say, okay, game in, game out, this is how the cards interact. And so I need to be thinking about the game with that context in mind and solving certain puzzles that arise in the format. And in each format, because the pieces interact differently, you're going to need to solve new puzzles. So the two big picture ideas I'm going to present to us today, they're kind of the two puzzles that I'm generally thinking about solving game in, game out. So for the first few days of this format, I actually wasn't winning very much. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't quite piece together what it was. I thought my decks looked okay. I thought I was playing the games pretty well. But it turned out that I was approaching this first puzzle here just completely wrong. I was basically approaching it from the inverse way that I think you should be approaching it. And that puzzle is figuring out long-term planning in this format. Because this is a format, unlike a lot of formats we've seen recently, that I think most of the time you're playing for the long game. You're not just trying to take the most aggressive line that ends the game quickest or puts you up the most tempo in the first 5 turns of the game. It's an important part of the game still. It's not a tempo devoid format by any means, but I think your default and most of your game actions and most of your thoughts of what you want to do and how you want to carry out the game should be thinking, how does this affect me in 2, 3, 4 turns? Where is the end game here? How am I going to win a late game versus my opponent here? And it's really funny because most of the time, the advice that I give to people in other formats is more, fight against that instinct that I think a lot of Magic players have to just squeeze every inch of value out of the cards you have. For example, if there's a card with multiple modes, kicker cards, for example, like just play that 4-drop on turn 4 if you don't have anything else to do with your mana. You don't have to kick it later. I think a lot of mistakes that people make in other formats are that they're not just affecting the board. They're not just spending their mana each turn. And that's the exact place I was coming from when I was first playing the games in this format. I was actually defaulting more to the just cast your card, just spend your mana every single turn, just get on board. And I was losing because of it. Thankfully, I realized that's why I was losing eventually. But it did take me some time to just be like, okay, you know what? Every time I take the play that leans towards like the tempo play, I'm getting punished somehow. For example, maybe I've got a good beatdown going. I went 2 into 3 into 4. And I have one removal spell in my hand. I'm like, okay, I'll clear that blocker. I'll put my opponent to 7. Next turn, I can probably kill them. Oh, and also I think important to this kind of example, that you had an alternative play you could have made, right? You're like, okay, I can cast this removal spell, get in, put them to a low life total, or you could have played just like a 5-mana 5/5, right? So instead you cast the 2-mana removal spell to throw from the saddle. You didn't use all your mana. You didn't develop your board a little bit more. You chose to go for the tempo play. So lethal is in sight, and they play something as simple as just like a Spinewood Paladin, right? The 5-mana 5/4 gain 3 life. I'm like, hey, that punished me a little bit because I took the tempo play, and I thought they were going to be a lower life total, but they went up a little bit of life, and then maybe I untap. Maybe I even draw something pretty good. I draw another beefy creature, but I'm out of removal because that was my last removal spell, and they slam a really good rare, and I just can't come back from that. That's the experience that was happening over and over. I was facing these Grixis Crime decks and these black-green decks, and I was just like, okay, you know what? I think I need to anticipate that my opponents are just going to have a little more action, a few more ways to catch back up in this format, because, the removal is pretty good. Often you can have some pretty good double spell turns if you fall a little bit behind. There's a lot of creatures in this set that make 2 bodies. So, for example, your opponent just casts a removal spell on your creature, then casts a Rictus Robber, the 4-mana 4/3 that if something died, you make it 2/2, and it's like, well, my aggressive plan that I was really, I thought I was going to kill them in a turn, they really punished that, and I used my resources a little bit too willingly, thinking they wouldn't be able to stabilize, and that just wasn't the case. So what you're aiming to do most of the time is not try to set up a board and then count to 20, get your opponent from 20 to 0. I mean, that is the ultimate end goal, of course, but winning is actually, I think, more of a byproduct of developing your board in this format. So what I mean is, I think the path to winning, the most successful path to winning, is just get on board, have an advantageous board state, or maybe if you're playing like a Grixis Crime deck, just, you're up a million cards on your opponent. That's also another way you can set it up a long-term win. But let's just say you're playing black-green, right? You're trying to figure out a way, how can I build up a board where I'm not getting pressured, and then I end up with the biggest thing, and I can start attacking, and my opponent just eventually runs out of options, right? It's not really a race to 0. It's more just trying to put yourself in a good position to be ahead of your opponent in multiple ways, up on cards or up on board presence, and then you just convert that into a win incidentally. So yeah, let's talk about how to put this into practice. So I think spree cards are a pretty poignant example of this, where a card like Dance of the Tumbleweeds, right? This is the green ramp spell, or you can make a giant creature. And this card, I really try my best not to cast it on turn 3. Maybe if I think that there's a really good setup, I've got a good 5 into a good 6 and the lands to be able to cast them, yeah, sure, I'll cast it on turn 3. But I want to get full value out of this card. I want this card to be a giant creature that gets me a land, not just a 3-mana ramp spell. And I think Dance of the Tumbleweeds might be kind of an obvious one if you've played a bunch. Just casting it on turn 3 just to get a land is maybe not the most exciting thing. Maybe you're a multicolor deck and that's really good for you. But if you're just like a 2-color deck, 2-color to splash, I generally want to wait. Let me put it this way. I feel pretty good when my opponent casts a dance on turn 3. I mean, sometimes I'm like, uh-oh, that means they have a really good turn 4 coming. They have a really good 5-drop or a really good 6-drop. They're going to play an Armadillo, Spinewood's Armadillo ahead of curve. But sometimes they just don't. They just casted their card, and then I'm just like, oh, they didn't have any great follow-up. All right, pretty happy about that. It's so much worse when they then cast Dance on turn 8 instead and get a 9/9. That's really when you're like, oh, okay, it's another threat I have to deal with. And I think that might be obvious to a lot of people with the Dance of the Tumbleweeds, but I think even a better example here is Getaway Glamour. This is the single white mana instant. Also a spree card. You can pay an additional 1 to blink something. You can pay an additional 2 to destroy target creature if no other creature had greater power. So this card, if you've got nothing going on turn 3, your opponent played like a Grizzly, like a 4/2, and you're like, okay, I probably don't want to take 8 damage from this or whatever. Sure, you cast it, but if you're keeping pace with your opponent, you played a 2, your opponent played a 2, you don't have anything to do with your mana on turn 3, and your opponent played, a kind of okay creature, maybe a possum, right? The uncommon saddle possum that becomes a 4/5, and you can pick something up when you saddle it. If that's the biggest thing, am I going to spend my turn killing the possum? Maybe, but you know what I'll probably do instead? I'll just pass the turn, I'll wait. Maybe they cast something that I want to kill instead with their 4 mana. Maybe they play a giant beaver. Or maybe they didn't play anything and they didn't add to the board. They just passed the turn. They've got a bunch of removal spells in hand. And I actually do want to save this Getaway Glamour to kill something and blink something good of mine. Especially, if your opponent does have a lot of removal spells in hand, you can set something up where you save one of your creatures, kill one of theirs. So that's really how I'm thinking about a lot of these spree cards. And again, this is the default. It's not going to happen every single time. I think one of the smaller puzzles, or the puzzle within the puzzle here, is that you do need to recognize when you should just cast your card on curve, when you are starting to fall behind on board, when you do just, for example, maybe need to cast your Rictus Robber, the 4-mana 4/3 black zombie that comes in and makes a zombie if something's died this turn. That card, there's a lot of times my opponent's got that plotted, and they're falling behind on board, and I'm like, all right, attack you, and they're just not casting it, because they're like, oh, I really want to get full value out of it. That might be the default, but when you're just dying, and I think that's really the tip-off. If you feel like, oh wow, I'm under a lot of pressure here, you should just affect the board. But if you're not under that much pressure, your opponent doesn't have giant green things that you can't deal with, that's when I'm willing to just default to, okay, let's make the long game play here. Let's try to get full value out of my cards. Another example here, Honest Redstein, the black-green uncommon Gravedigger thing. A lot of people have asked me when I've been streaming, like, do you ever play out Redstein on turn 3? Or is it wild to play out Redstein on turn 3 just to get the creatures you cast cost 1 less to cast mode? I don't think it's wild, but I would really hesitate. I'd really think about it. Like, it would have to be kind of like the Dance the Tumbleweeds example I said. There'd have to be a pretty good lineup of stuff that I'm seeing in my hand, being like, oh, it's really good if I can cast Redstein on 2, cast 2 3-drops next turn, then cast a 6-drop ahead of schedule. And even in that situation, I would probably still want to have like another piece of recursion in my hand, because if I just make the explosive play, I go Redstein into a bunch of stuff, and my opponent has answers for those. So I think, okay, kill one of your 3-drops, kill your 5-drop, then I do end up in that situation where I'm like, wow, I used all my resources here, and I have nothing to show for it, basically. And one of the reasons that this happens in this format is kind of like I mentioned before, there's a lot of good removal. So when you're playing a game of Magic, when you're expecting to be interacted with, when it's not just ships in the night, you should expect the game to go longer, and you need to plan for the game to go longer, because the game will slow down, and that is what happens a lot of the time in this format. So is it absurd to think about playing Honest Redstein on turn 3? If you've got maybe more recursion in your hand and you've got a really good setup, or you really feel like, yeah, this is the right thing to do, no, for sure. But it's definitely not my default. And here's the key. Here's the really pressing point. If Honest Redstein is the only thing I can do on turn 3, like I have no other ways to spend my mana, I probably won't play it out. And that's not the case for a lot of other formats. Now, going back to, if you're getting pressured, if your opponent's gone like, Miriam into a good mount, yeah, of course, I'm just going to want to affect the board. You kind of just have to. But in all other situations, nah, just chill. The game's going to go a little bit longer. You're going to have time to get value. And trying to figure out how to best plan for the long term is why I really like the discard spells in this format. Binding Negotiation, which is the 1-black one that you can look at your opponent's hand, take something, or you can put a plot card into their graveyard and humiliate the black-white one from the bonus sheet that takes something, puts a counter on something. I really like those cards because they tell me how I should be using my cards. If I should just go dance into the big explosive play because my opponent actually doesn't have any removal, or I take their only removal spell. Or maybe they've got a bunch of removal spells in hand. I'm like, okay, I want to sequence my creatures in a way that entices them into using their removal spells, my lesser things, so that my best thing can stick around. And I think these discard spells generally will play better in the hands of good players who have a good sense of that kind of stuff, kind of understand what my opponents might do based on what I want to do. I think discard spells are pretty tricky to play. It's not just like, take the best card in their hand. I think that's, kind of the default for a lot of people. But you really want to think about not just what's the best card in their hand, it's more, how do things line up? Like here, I'll give you a good example of this, right? I was playing a pretty long game. I was like a multicolor green deck versus like a Grixis Crime deck. And we were kind of in the mid game. It was maybe around turn 6, and my hand was Roxanne, the green-red rare that comes in, makes meteorites, kills things, great card. And I also had a Mourner's Surprise, the 1-black, buy some back, make a mercenary. So I had a lot of mana in play. The game was kind of at a standstill. I had maybe like 7, 8 mana in play, and my opponent Binding Negotiationed me and just snap took the Roxanne, right? And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if you just take the Mourner's Surprise, well, I just have the Roxanne. But if you take my Roxanne, you put that in the grave, I get to Mourner Surprise it back, get a 1/1 mercenary, and still cast the Roxanne. And that's just a simple example, right? The examples can get a lot more complex than that, but just think about how your opponent's actually going to be playing their cards. Like I said, it's easy to snap, be like, yep, let me take their best thing, but think about not just how you think they're going to play your cards, but how your cards line up against theirs. I'm not going to take their good threat if I have 4 removal spells in my hand. My removal spells, I can just kill that thing. I mean, if it has a good enter the battlefield effect, maybe you're going to want to take the good threat. But if my hand's a bunch of removal spells and I Binding Negotiation them, I'm probably going to take their card draw spell, their value engine, their removal spells instead, because those are the things I can't answer. Another way you can plan for the long term and be good at grinding is when you have a creature that stands to get value if you do a thing. In a lot of games, if they're going a little bit long, I really try to make sure that I cast that creature and get the trigger, get my value, before my opponent can remove it. So a good example of this is Marchesa Death Dealer, which is the Grixis 3/4 that whenever you commit a crime, you can pay 1. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand, the rest in the graveyard. Most of the time, I'm not just going to jam this card on turn 3, because what's going to happen is my opponent's just going to cleanly kill it, and it's like, all right, I didn't get any value. I'm going to want to wait till turn 5 to combo this with a crime land, or turn 6, combo with a removal spell. So even if my opponent does have a removal spell, I'm still up on that exchange, right? So I think another way to put all the stuff that we've been talking about is really the bottlenecked resource I find in this format is cards. I think that games don't often end with you having a bunch of cards in hand and just being like, oh, my opponent killed me and my opponent out-tempoed me. Most of the time when I win a game, it's because I'm up 4 or 5 cards in the opponent, or my opponent out-carded me and had some really good 2-for-1 exchanges. So make sure you're getting your 2-for-1. Make sure you're putting yourself in positions where you can set up these exchanges so you get your guaranteed value like you can with Marchesa. And then just, one simple thing is just make sure that you're pointing your removal spells at the right thing. I really am cautious about the last removal spell. I don't want to end up in a spot where the games kind of come down to a grind and my opponent just slams a bomb I can't deal with. I'm really conservative about that last removal spell. I really want to make sure that if I'm using it, it's to deal with something I can't deal with otherwise. It's something that I can't just block. It's a card that, if gone uncontested, will just take over the game. So just don't jump the gun on the removal spells. That's all. And right before we get to the next topic here, if you are enjoying the show and you want to support the show, go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the #1 place that you can go if you like the show or any of my content. Really does help the show keep on going. Truly cannot say thank you enough to people that support each week. And, like I always like to say, there's a bunch of rewards that we want to give back to you if you choose to support us. So go check that out if you're interested in any rewards. All those rewards being focused on getting you better at limited magic, or if you want to support the content. Thanks so much. All right, so that's going to do it for our first puzzle of just how to play the long game, thinking about the long game. Second puzzle here, and this is one that from the very first game of this format I played, I kind of just thought, oh, there's so many options in this space, and it's going to come up pretty much every game, is sequencing. And sequencing is a large umbrella term, but if you haven't heard sequencing, it just means the order you're doing things in, which is a sequence, of course. And there's so many cards in this format that want you to do things in a specific order, or challenge you to do things in the right order to get the best outcome. And that's really the challenge of sequencing. There's so many options of how you could arrange things, but arranging things, doing things in the right order to get the most advantageous outcome is the puzzle you're trying to solve. A brief overview here. We've got lands, like the crime lands that come in ping. Well, do you want to play those on turn 1? Or maybe you want to play them later to trigger a crime. There's plot cards and cards like Loan Shark that say whenever you've cast your second spell each turn, you draw a card. Well, are you going to be plotting something on turn 3 and casting your Loan Shark on 4? Or maybe you can't plot on turn 3 because you have to affect the board, but then your Loan Shark can't draw a card the next turn. So it's all these decisions like that. Crimes, of course, really ask you to sequence things in particular ways, especially because the crime triggers, a lot of them are once per turn. So sometimes you want to stagger your triggers so that you go, I play a crime land on my turn, cast an instant on my opponent's turn. And so the set's just littered with these small decisions that I think if you get these sequencing decisions wrong, can really have some lasting impact on how effective your cards are, basically. And the first step to figuring out the correct sequencing is understanding the parts of the sequence. So what that means is when you untap and you have all the options available in front of you, what's on board, what's in your hand, you really need to be taking in what your options actually are. What are the potential plays you could be making? Because if that's not the first place you're going, if that's not the first thing you're thinking about when you're starting your turn, and you're just taking game actions, you're going to missequence things at some point, of course, because you're just not taking in all the potential options. So I would really suggest, if sequencing is something that you feel is a little bit, you need a little bit of practice on it, something you feel like, oh, I always miss things here and there, take a bit of a breather at the beginning of your turn and be like, okay, what are the actual options I have available to me? And go through the motions of saying, well, I could do this, this, and this, A, B, and C, or I could do C, B, and A, whatever permutation, and what gives me the best outcome. This is tricky because sometimes it's not just on your one turn, what is the best outcome, but it's over multiple turns, like I described with plotting, or especially, and we'll just jump into it here, with those crime lands, right? So you're playing a crime deck, and you've got a tap land in your opening hand. Well, do you want to play it on turn 1? Or do you want to save it for a little bit later? I've been defaulting to actually just playing my tap lands on turn 1 a little more often than not, because I've found that, yes, it's nice to get a little incidental crime here and there, but more often than not, I've been punished for holding these tap lands. I think that unless you have a very clear, like, I've got 4 lands in hand, and I don't have a lot of expensive things, and I can clearly see I have a turn where I can go Raven of Fell Omens on 2, and a Crime Payoff Lazav on turn 3, and then I can play a Crime Land on turn 4, cast another 3-drop. If you don't see those sequences in your opening hand, I think you should just play these tap lands on turn 1, especially if you're a multicolor deck where you might need a specific color on turn 1. And if you don't get that color down on turn 1, it might have major ramifications on turn 4, 5, and 6 where you're just a step behind of your opponent, and because you didn't get that one tap land in play, like that right there on turn 1, you actually kind of lost the game without even knowing it. Like, you know, for example, I was doing a draft log review or a gameplay review the other day, and the person had a Forsaken Miner, which is the single black mana 2/2 that can't block whenever you commit a crime, pay black to return to the battlefield. And they played that on turn 1 instead of a tap land. And the tap land was a green-blue tap land, I believe. And they were playing like a multicolor deck, and there was a Buried in the Garden in their opening hand. And they needed to cast that Buried in the Garden on turn 4 because the opponent played some really good rare, and they weren't able to, because instead they chose to play the Forsaken Miner on turn 1. And again, this goes back to the previous puzzle of long-term planning, where in some formats, yeah, you just want to get that 2-power creature down on turn 1 so you can start beating down. I think in most decks in this format, unless you're a very focused, like red-black, outlaw aggro deck, sure, I can understand that, but most decks in this format aren't going to need to play that 1 mana 2/2 on turn 1 to start bashing in there. It's much more important that you prioritize your sequencing in a way that sets you up so that your turn 3, 4, 5, 6 and forward are good so you can interact with what your opponent's doing. So yeah, my default has just been to like play these tap lands on turn 1 unless there's a very clear, obvious sequence of like, okay, I know I can hold this. And the other thing too is if you don't think you have the computing power, the bandwidth to do all this sequencing, it might not be optimal, for sure, to always play that tap land on turn 1, but there might be a good chance that if you don't think you're good at all this sequencing and can't make the right decision, it might just be better to play the tap land on turn 1, because I think more often than not, if you were just a coin flip and just say like, oh, 50% of the time I play it on turn 1, 50% of the time I hold it, I think the times that you coin flipped and said, okay, I'm just going to hold it, I think those would actually lead you to losing more games rather than winning more games. Conduit Pylons is another one to talk about here. So this is the desert that comes in untapped, taps out a colorless, or you can pay 1, tap it to filter a mana, add 1 mana of any color. This one's interesting because, of course, you can play this at any time. Comes in untapped. It really, it doesn't have the same problem as the deserts we just talked about. But really, you're thinking about, when do you want to surveil? When is a surveil most valuable for you? Well, generally, I think the surveil is most valuable for you when you need a specific thing in your hand or you're looking for something. I try not to play my pylons early on unless I'm looking for a removal spell that I don't have in my opening hand, or a specific color, or maybe there's in your opening hand you can see there's a spot in your curve that you need to fill in, like you don't have a 4-drop, you don't have a good turn 4 play, so you're digging for it. So I do try to hold my pylons or any cantrips, right? This applies to any cantrips in any constructed formats generally, or just whenever you have a card, like a cheap card that says, okay, I can look at a card and draw a card, get a little bit of card selection. You generally do want to hold that until you have an opportunity to be like, I know what I need, I know what I'm digging for. Because sometimes you run into the situation where you play your pylons and you're like, I actually don't know if I want my 5th land here, right? Like, I could want it, but I also could draw this here, say, okay, I have a 5-drop in hand, and then flood a bunch, because my next 3 cards were also lands. I would prefer to hold that until turn 4, being like, okay, I've already drawn that 5th land, I don't need a 6th land, so I can just bin that land. One that comes up for me pretty often is when you have an Outcaster Greenblade, the 3-mana 1/2 uncommon that goes and gets a desert, and then gets +1/+1 for each desert you control. Well, I think the default is just to go grab a desert from your deck and have like, okay, I can grow my Greenblade here. But you also sometimes want to just go get a basic, because on a future turn, you just want to have that untapped land guaranteed to be able to play your 5-drop on 5 or your 6-drop on 6. You're really weighing, in this specific situation, what's better, for my Greenblade to get +1/+1, or for me to cast my card on time. And again, if you're somebody who has a little bit of trouble just weighing these sequencing decisions, you can just boil it down to this or that, just like I did here. Do you want your Greenblade bigger? Is that the important thing here? Does that Greenblade need to block their 2-drop that you've been getting beaten down by, and you're on the draw, and they're going to play a 4, and the Greenblade also maybe can block the 4? Is that important here? Or do you have like an excellent 5-drop that you just need to make, a Terror of the Peaks that you really want to make sure that comes down on turn 5 instead? And this is why I actually really like having a Conduit Pylons in my deck, because then you can have the option to get an untapped desert to have your cake and eat it too. Or with the Dance of the Tumbleweeds, being able to get that in the late game, get a little bit of value. That's always something that's pretty nice. I'm a big believer in pylons in this format. I do tend to take my first one highly, partially because it gives you a little bit of agency, just being able to, make some surveil decisions, but also spots like that where you want to go fetch a land, and you can have that option of going to get an untapped desert for something like the Greenblade. A really, really simple sequencing suggestion that I would have here, and this applies to basically every format, is if you lay out all your options for the turn, And for sure, one of the things involves drawing cards. Let's say you have an intimidation campaign. The one blue-black enchantment, comes in, drains, draws a card. When you commit a crime, you pick it back up. If you know that that's going to be part of your turn, that should be the first thing you do. Because when you draw a card off this, that might change your plan. You can reassess from there. And this includes playing a land. You generally don't want to play your land before you cast the campaign, because if you draw a tap land and you don't need that one additional mana this turn, you can get your tap land down this turn. And I've actually seen this happen quite a bit in this format with this exact example with Intimidation Campaign. Both myself doing it and, hopefully learning from it quicker than not, but also just, a lot of other people doing this too, where if I had just not played my land on the turn, I cast my Intimidation Campaign for the first time, or maybe, on turn 4, turn 5, whatever, and I got a tap land down on that turn, then 2-3 turns later, I would be able to triple spell in a way that I wasn't able to because I couldn't play my tap land, or I didn't play my tap land on the one turn, I couldn't afford to on the next, and I couldn't afford to on the one after, and then when I was really back against the wall, I needed that additional mana, I didn't have it. And then when it comes to plot cards, often the do you want this or do you want that the sequencing puzzle offers you is, do you want the value or do you want the tempo? Again, this goes back to the previous puzzle where sometimes you do just need to cast your Loan Shark on turn 4, you're getting attacked, you can't afford to plot this, but most of the time I do try to plot my Loan Sharks and my Wolverines. One little tip I actually want to point out here that might not be super obvious is when you have something like Slick Sequence, which is the blue-red instant, deals 2 to something, if you've cast another spell this turn, you draw a card, and Loan Shark, let's just say that's plotted, right? What you can do is you cast your Loan Shark for free, of course, hold full control, Loan Shark on the stack, cast your Slick Sequence, you've cast the Loan Shark, you get to draw your card off the Slick Sequence, and of course, the Slick Sequence will then be your, you fill the condition of cast a spell. So you actually get to, it might not seem like it at first, where you're like, I have to do one or the other, but you do actually get to have both if you full control, or, in real life, just say I'm holding priority, basically is what you would do. So yeah, this is by no means an extensive list of all the sequencing things that come up in this format, but just be on the lookout for them. Like I said, the way you want to approach this is taking in all of your options. And that's the first step here. If you're not sure of all of your options, you're not going to be able to make those right sequencing decisions. So, and as you get better at this, you'll be able to do it over multiple turns. It's not just a one-turn thing, although you might have to start there. Think about how your decisions on one turn may have ramifications on future turns. And just like with anything in Magic that's kind of tricky, it only gets easier if you start thinking about it. It seems a bit daunting to be like, oh, I have to think about 4 turns down the road. Start thinking about it, flex that muscle, and eventually become second nature. All right, now just talk about some individual cards here. So first up, we've got a combo of Snakeskin Veil and Take Up the Shield, the protection spells in this format. And some questions I've got around these cards are, how do you play around them? How do you even play into them sometimes when you know your opponent has them? Like, when do you want to go, all right, I'll cast my removal spell here, use Snakeskin Veil or Take Up the Shield, and then we carry on with the game. It's pretty complicated. Unfortunately, the best way to not let these cards be that effective is just don't fall behind on board, because when these cards are at their best is when you fall a bit behind on board, your opponent got off to a fast start, maybe you had a hand that's a little bit slow, had a few too many tap lands, your opponent got to go 2-drop, 3-drop, they were on the play, and their creatures, like the green decks tend to be, their creatures are a little bit bigger than yours, and you can't really block effectively with the creature you might play on turn 3 or turn 4, and so then you go, okay, I kind of have to just cast my removal spell, but that gets foiled by them having one of these protection spells. So if you can, set yourself up so you don't get put in that position, make sure you're keeping pace with your green-white opponent in general. Going back to that Honest Rutstein example, against green-white, I will be playing out my value creatures, my Honest Rutstein on turn 3, so I can block a little more often. This is where the scales, the slides get shifted a little bit when you're facing that aggressive deck, because the game really does kind of end in a lot of ways when you go for that removal spell on turn 4, turn 5, they have one of these protection spells. So the most effective way to play around these cards, or put yourself in positions where these cards aren't very effective, is just to keep pace with the opponent. Have blockers that line up reasonably well with theirs, so they're either forced to take up the shield in combat and you don't take a bunch of damage, that's okay, an okay exchange with me, or they're forced to add more creatures to the board and then maybe they tap out and then you can cast your removal spell. If you're giving your opponent the luxury of just being like, hey, I can just not play another creature and instead keep up my my take up the shield here, then yeah, of course you're going to fall a little bit behind. But you do find yourself in these situations sometimes, even with good deck building and good mulligan decisions, where your opponent kind of has this face-up Snakeskin Veil in a lot of ways, where they've been holding up that 1 mana and, on Arena there's that stop. What do you do there? Well, a few situations to walk through here. Let's say you've got a bunch of removal spells in hand. Sometimes you just bite the bullet and you go, all right, I cast my first removal spell. You cast your protection spell. I then untap, cast another one. That's of course fine to do. The higher your life total is at that point, the more acceptable it is to do that, because often in the process of that, you're going to be taking a big hit from their like 4-2 Grizzly or whatever that's going to turn into a 5-2. So sometimes you just say, I'm just going to say face up, you're going to trade less mana than I am most likely, but I'm going to eventually kill that thing. That's something that happens pretty often. One thing you can do if you think it's Take Up the Shield and not Snakeskin Veil, and this kind of works only for Take Up the Shield, although sometimes Snakeskin Veil if things line up, is try to induce them into using it in combat. So, for example, if you do have a reasonable enough blocker and they attack in, you can go, all right, I block. They cast to Take the Shield to win the combat. You then get them with a removal spell. Often it's not going to work with Snakeskin Veil unless, you're like blocking a 4-4 and a 4-4 and they go, okay, one counter wins the combat. Things don't often line up as cleanly as that, but that's another way you can go about it. Not always an option, again, because a lot of times when you find yourself in these spots where Snakeskin Veil and Take Up the Shield are a big issue, it's because you don't have blockers that can deal with their creatures effectively. So not going to happen all the time, of course, but watch for those spots where it does, because that's really one of the most effective ways to get them. Really just get that clean 2-for-1. And then, I think really a lot of the time you kind of have to just assess the game and go, well, if they have these cards here, I probably just lose. But a good player is going to represent these cards sometimes anyways, just to, kind of, as not a bluff exactly, but they're going to put it in your head. They might just leave up. They might even do the thing where they go, okay, sneakily, like, manual tap, leave up a green, purposely to put that in your head. Sometimes you just have to not psych yourself out and be like, you know what? If they have Snakeskin Veil here, I'm not going to win this game anyways. I just have to cast my removal spell. I can't wait for an opportunity 2 turns down the line where I set something up. And if they have it, okay, I probably wasn't going to win this game anyways. But if they don't have it, you don't take an additional, 8 damage in the process trying to set up a situation where you're like, okay, maybe later I can block and then blow them out, right? So it's a tricky line to walk. It really is. I think this comes down to being good at analyzing the game state, good at knowing when you can play with your life total, good at knowing when you just have to kind of make them have it, good to be able to recognize when you have enough life to be able to set up something on a few turns down the road. And here's the thing, like, a lot of the time, it's just not going to work out. If you really think they have these cards in hand and your cards, you're all on all removal spells and your life total is low, it's not going to work out, and that's why these cards are good. That there's no perfect answer. There's no solution to this puzzle in particular that I can go, oh, you just do this. But all those little things in there, just keep them in mind. You might have opportunities arise that you can use those tips to good effect. Next up, I want to talk about Trash the Town. This is the green spree instant that you can pay 2 to put 2+1/+1 counters on something, pay 1 to give something trample, also pay 1 to give something, whenever this deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards. Do remember that you can spread this all out. I've seen a lot of opponents just like put it all on one thing, and then I blow them out with a removal spell, and they don't get any of their things, where if they instead tried to like win a combat one place, gave something else trample, and then the unblocked creature that they had drew 2 cards, I'd be in such a worse place, right? Just being like, okay, well, I didn't get blown out in combat, my creature survived, they didn't get to put their counters on things, but that big creature trampled over for 3 damage, and then they drew 2 cards, and it was still a very effective Trash the Town. So just something that I think it might be, non-intuitive if you haven't played with this card a ton. You can spread it out. Definitely don't have to put it all on one. Another card in the same vein where it's just like, oh yeah, I guess you can do that too. Getaway Glamour. This is the white spree card that you can blink something or destroy a target creature if no other creature had greater power. I think often you think of the modes of this card like, okay, I can either blink my thing for value and destroy their thing, or maybe blink my giant thing on the battlefield and destroy their thing. So, I blinked my 5-power creature, destroyed their 4-power creature because that was the biggest thing. But a mode that I've missed this a few times, and my stream has pointed it out, you can just, if they're attacking with a bunch of stuff, you can kill their biggest thing and blink one of their other attackers so you just don't take an additional few points of damage. I think that's a mode that, for whatever reason, for me anyways, it's not one that like pops into my head immediately. I'm sure it's the same for some other people, so just wanted to call that out. That's definitely a pretty nice mode. Just kill a thing, effectively gain 2 or 3 life by blinking one of their attackers. Outlaw Medic. This is the 1 and a white 1/3 life link that when it dies, draw a card. Actually, a card I've been playing quite a bit more as the format's gone on. I've been playing a lot of black-white in the last little while, and this card's really strong there. Not just, because sacrifice and stuff, but coming up the ground, there's a lot of like little small synergies with this card. And often, a missed opportunity I see with this card is just not throwing it into a double block or a triple block to gain a little bit of life. Maybe you don't need to add the point of power to win the combat, but, it's a free point of life. They're probably not going to kill this, right? And if they do, okay, great, you get your card back. Just a small edge. There's a lot of situations I've seen people not just get that free point of life. So yeah, don't be that person. Highway Robbery. This is the 1 in a red sorcery that has plot for 1 in a red, and you can discard a card or sacrifice a land. If you do, draw 2 cards. This one's interesting because you know we haven't really had this version of this effect where it asks you to either discard a card or sacrifice a land, or if we have, it hasn't been that common. But way more often than I would have expected, I've seen opponents sacrifice a land on like turn 4, and I would assume that's because they like all the cards in their hand and they're just like, oh, I can get rid of a land. But when you're casting a card like this, like a card draw spell, you want your lands in play so you can then cast your spells, cast multiple spells, cast expensive spells. So yeah, there's definitely an allure to being like, well, all my cards are great. I just want to keep all my cards, or I've got, the best cards in my deck, which, it's very rare that your 4 or 5 cards in your hand are going to be actually the best cards in your deck. I think even if you think your hand is high quality, don't sacrifice a land before like turn 6, I would say, for turn 5 at the earliest, because so much of the time, I think that's just going to come back to bite you. And this isn't something that I would even bring up if I hadn't seen it a bunch. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe, I haven't seen these people's hands. I could be wrong. Maybe it is totally correct to. But I think it would be unlikely given the number of times I've seen that kind of thing happen. So just think about that when you're drawing cards, you want your lands in play. Next up, we've got Rooftop Assassin. This is the 3 in a black 2/2 flying lifelink flash that when it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. I run this card out quite a bit on turn 4 without killing something. Again, I've been playing Blackway a lot, so this is a card that's pretty good there. And that sort of kind of sounds like it fights against what I was saying earlier in this episode about keeping your cards for full value as the default. But the difference is that lifelink, you actually are getting value. Like, you're getting a life advantage. That 2 points per turn, if this keeps connecting, that is still something. That is still, in my mind, value. It's a resource of some sort. So, sure, maybe you're not actually killing something, but let's just say you don't have anything else going on. Where, if the Rusting example, I'm like, no, I'm not going to play it out. With the Assassin, if this is my turn 4 play, I'm going to play it out most likely. 2 cards here in green now that have sort of the same warning here. Beast Bond Outcaster is the 3 mana 3/3 uncommon with plot for 2 mana. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature power 4 or greater, draw a card. And Tumbleweed Rising, 1 in a green, plot for 3 mana. Create an XX green elemental creature token where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. Recently, I've gotten a lot of people, I think, just casting these into open mana when they only have 1 creature on the battlefield. So, you're not drawing your card from your Outcaster. That's not the worst thing in the world, but just having your Tumbleweed Rising be a blank, be an actual, like, you get 2 for 1. That is really, really bad. So, I mean, the lesson here is just don't cast your things into a lot of open mana. If they have 2 mana, 3 mana, it depends on the colors, right? Because it could be Murder. That could really get you. Desert's Dew with a lot of deserts in play. This goes back to don't just cast your cards. Look at what your opponent's doing. Make sure that you're not just going to get completely blown out of the water. I do want to draw my card off my Outcaster. I said it's not a disaster, but it still is pretty bad if you just have, if it's just 3 mana 3/3. You really do want to draw a card off of this. So yeah, just be wary. Look what colors your opponent's playing. Look when they're leaving up open mana, because if they just pass the turn on turn 4, 4 up a mana, it's almost for sure they have an interaction spell of some sort, because they know these cards are coming, right? They are in the exiles and they can see them face up. Your opponent is a sentient human being, not an NPC. They're gonna make choices based on your decisions to blow you out if they can. Next up, a little thing I want to mention about Free Strider Commando. This is the 3 mana, 2 in a green, 3/3, has plot for 3 in a green, and it says very, particular wording here. It enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it if it wasn't cast or no mana was spent to cast it. So, of course, the joke here was with plot, but you can also reanimate this with either Badlands Revival or something like Lively Dirge, which is the uncommon one that reanimates, say, 4 mana value worth of stuff, to actually get those counters. It actually works that way, too. So, not always going to be the most exciting reanimation target, but sometimes just a 5/5 is what you need, right? And especially with Lively Dirge, just getting, getting a 1-drop plus this, a Nezumi Link Breaker plus Free Strider Commando, yeah. Sometimes that's good enough, and don't miss that line if that's one that you want to take, basically. Next up, we've got Phantom Interference. This is the blue counterspell. You counter the spell unless they pay 2, or you can pay 3 to make a 2/2 flying spirit token. This card is still a card I like quite a bit. I think it's still a strong card, but I do think it's pretty tricky to use because you can't just leave it up without anything else. I think it is best in a deck, like counterspells usually are, with a bunch of other instants, because especially at this point in the format, people have kind of sussed out, they have in their head, like, okay, Phantom Interference, play around interference, don't forget to play my land before I cast my spell. Maybe cast a 2-drop on turn 4 instead of my slam my great 4-drop, right? So people tend to play around it. I think it's still good because there's going to be some point in the game where you can get them with it, or even if they've kind of sussed it out, they still do have to play around it. They have to respect it. It's not nothing, right? It's not like they go, oh, I know about this card. No, it's nothing at all. No, it still costs them something to not just jam their 4 into their 5 into their 6, right? If they're going to play around it. So just you have to know that you can't just pass the turn at this point of the format thinking, okay, they're just going to walk their awesome thing into it. I think if you don't have anything else to do with your mana, I would maybe consider casting something else instead of holding up interference. Unless you're just fine, you've got 4 mana, you're fine making a token, just making the spirit token. If you say, if they cast something, then sure, I'll counter it. If they cast a 2-drop on turn 4, or like they just don't cast anything, I'm fine casting the spirit token. But generally when I've had other options of things to do with my mana, I've tended to not cast Phantom Interference. So just a warning to be like, don't expect to always get something when you pass the turn with the interference. And again, I still think it's a good card, even though it can be a little bit awkward in those spots. Just want to talk about scrying just quickly. Cards like Holy Cow and Trained Airynx and Sterling Hound, which surveils. One of the common things I hear is people saying like, I'm not very good at scrying, or I don't know what to scry on top, or when to keep a card. And, I could go really deep on this, but I'll just give kind of some small insights on this. If you're not looking for anything in particular, when you're scrying, you're like, okay, I need a removal spell, I need a land, I need a, whatever it is. My default question I ask myself is, whenever I look at the cards on top, like, I cast my Holy Cow and I scry 1, I go, is this card on top better than the average card in my deck currently? And it helps, of course, to know what your deck contents are, looking on 17 lands, or if you have a tracker like Untapped GG or something. But that's really what you're asking yourself. You're saying, is this card I'm seeing going to be better or worse on average than the next card down? And, when I say better or worse, it's not just abstractly how good the card is, but in the situation you're in. And another thing you might want to ask yourself, going back to the long-term planning, you may say, well, this card, let's just say it's an expensive card, a 6-drop, I can't cast it right now, but it's going to be pretty good in a few turns. And, you're at 5 lands. You'll see that 6th land by the time you get to, it's a Spinewoods Armadillo. You're like, okay, I can probably keep that. When you're scrying, it certainly is beneficial to have that good sense of what you need the next turn, the turn after, the turn after. That'll inform your scry decisions. But I think really, if you are somebody who knows they have that, that's a little bit of difficulty being like, is this good enough to keep? Oh, that's just the main question. Is this card better or worse than the average spell I could draw, or the average card I could draw in my deck? And that's important. That distinction I just made, because you've got a lot of lands in your deck sometimes, right? Is this better than a land? Sometimes it's not. And here's, the flip side of that is I think people walk into the trap sometimes of going, well, this isn't a land. This 2-drop. You draw like a Bristlepack Centaur or a Voracious Varmint on something, or you're scry that on turn 5. And you're like, well, it's not a land, so it's better than a land, right? You don't want it to be just better than a land. It needs to be better or dead average to the average card in your deck. 2 colorless 3-mana fixers here. We've got Oasis Gardener, which is a 3-mana 2/2 that ETBs, gains 2 life and taps for mana of any color. And Red Rock Sentinel, the 3-mana 2/4 defender. 2 tap, sack a land, draw a card, and create a treasure token. As the format's gone on, and more people are playing these cards, and decks are a little more colorful, you have to kind of branch out into other colors to maybe get a requisite power level deck. I've been more and more happy just to, when they play a Gardener on 3, I just kill it. I just point my removal spell on it, because that might shut them off of their splash. That might shut them off of multiple cards. Maybe you get lucky and you actually do kind of mana screw them. They were relying on the Gardener for their 4th mana source. So, not every single time, but keep it as an option, right? If you don't think what you're adding to the board that turn, or what you could add to the board, is pretty good, yeah, I would just snap off a Desert Stew, or Thundering Salvo on, or whatever. Pretty happy about that. Red Rock Sentinel, a little bit different. Sometimes you'll kill us on turn 3. It's a little bit more of a cost for them to actually unlock some mana, like a different color with this. They have to sack a land, that costs 2 mana. It's not quite as easy to just be like, okay, just kill that right away. But where I do like killing Red Rock Sentinel is if you don't think you have the game locked up in 3 turns, maybe at a maximum, I would just say, yeah, you got to kill the Sentinel, because that thing's going to help them churn through lands. It's going to maybe even they have some uses for the treasures, not just casting their spells, but using those as actually pieces of material. So yeah, this Red Rock Sentinel tends to be a card I think you do want to kill as the game goes on. And Oasis Gardener, I guess, is kind of the opposite, right? Where it's like, as the game goes on, you, of course, don't really need to kill it, because usually they have their mana in play. And I guess the other thing, too, is like, when you're considering, should I kill an Oasis Gardener on turn 3? Look at what lands they have. Do they have a Pylons in play? Well, probably don't need to kill it if, they've already got 5 colors. Do they have, like, 3 colors on board, like a tapped green-black dual land and an island? Well, okay, I mean, maybe they're splashing a 4th color, but that changes the equation enough, so I'm going to be like, okay, I'll probably just play my own thing instead of killing the gardener. An interaction that we talked about in the set review way back when, and I've got a lot of questions about it, just exactly how this works. This is a boomer interaction, so if you've heard this and you know what this is, then, great, but I'm sure there's a lot of people who still don't quite get what this interaction is. So this interaction is between Oblivion Ring effects, so Journey to Nowhere, Detention Sphere, that's another one that works like this. Basically, any of these enchantments that come in and exile something, and then when they leave, you return the thing. But only the ones, we're only talking about the ones here that have it in 2 separate triggers. So for Journey to Nowhere, for example, it says, when Journey to Nowhere enters the battlefield, exile target creature. And then it has a second paragraph. This is not tied to the first thing. It says, when Journey to Nowhere leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Something like Mystical Tether will just say, when it enters the battlefield, exile its target creature until Mystical Tether leaves the battlefield. It's just one thing. But since this is 2 triggers, what you can do is you can bounce your own Journey to Nowhere, Detention Sphere, in response to the first trigger. So what you're going to do is you play your Journey, you target your opponent's creature. It says when it enters the battlefield, exile target creature. That trigger is going to go on the stack. And with that trigger on the stack still, you cast your Failed Forwarding, for example, the 2-mana bounce spell to bounce target non-land permanent. You can also do this with this town ain't big enough. That also targets non-land permanent. So trigger on the stack, you cast your Failed Forwarding or your bounce spell, you return the Journey to your hand, and what happens then is the secondary trigger will go on the stack, though, when this leaves the battlefield to return. And so you've got at the bottom of the stack is the exile target creature thing. Your opponent's creature is not off the battlefield. And on the top of the stack, the new trigger is created, the leaves the battlefield one. So what happens is, reverse out order, first in, last out. The leaves the battlefield trigger will resolve, but nothing will happen, obviously, because there's no creature exiled just yet. And then the when Journey enters the battlefield trigger resolves. So now you've exiled your opponent's creature for good. You have the Journey back in your hand now. So you've effectively turned the Failed Forwarding into a secondary Journey to Nowhere copy in your hand. So just a little bit of a cool thing here and there. I know a lot of longtime players know this trick, but a lot of players probably don't. They changed the wording on these cards quite a while ago. I think back in like 2013. So it's definitely been a while that these cards are no longer printed in this template. You're used to the newer template, and if you haven't seen these cards before or haven't made that distinction, probably don't even notice it. So I just wanted to point that out for those people who have not had that described. To close us out here, I just have a few thoughts on a few rares. So Bonnie Paul Clear Cutter, the 3 green blue 6/5 reach creature. Best creature in the set, most likely, that comes in, makes the bow token. Whenever you attack, draw a card, all that good stuff. Something I found that's really effective with this card is getting to 6 mana and then casting it. All right, next card up, we've got Hellspur Posse Boss. This is 2 red for the 2/4 that says Outlaws you control have haste, or other outlaws specifically. And when it enters the battlefield, you create 2 red mercenary creature tokens. So the thing about this card that is really easy to just kind of click through if you're playing on Arena is you generally, if you have a removal spell in hand, you want to kill this before the mercenary token trigger resolves, right? Because then they can't use the mercenaries that turn. I've actually had a game or two where I won, or at least pulled for pretty far ahead, because my opponent had a removal spell in hand and he didn't respond to the trigger, and I was able to use the mercenary token. So just watch out for that, right? Because of course, the thing to spell it out here, if you kill the Posse Boss, those mercenary tokens no longer have haste, so you have to wait a turn cycle for them to activate. So just something to watch out for. And then a mythic here, Anti-Flash the Veteran. This is the 3 red, green, white 4/5 flash that when it enters the battlefield, you reanimate a permanent with mana value 3 or less. And secondary line of text here, when Andy becomes tapped, exile the top 2 creatures of your library. You can play those cards this turn. So I just want to talk about that last part there, because it's very easy to, somebody asks you, what does Anti-Flash do? It's like, oh, she reanimates something, and when she attacks, you get to draw 2 cards. No, it's when she becomes tapped. So of course that means you can use her to saddle to something, or if maybe the board's stalled out and you don't actually want to get any flash into combat, what you can do, well, saddling, that counts, that's one thing, but also you can have the Keykeeper, right, the tapper, so you can pay like 3 mana to tap the anti-flash, effectively draw 2 cards per turn for 3 mana. So just, another thing I wanted to call out there. My opponents kind of had a rude awakening to that the other day, where they tried to tap my anti-flash with their Keykeeper, and I like drew 2 removal spells off of that. So just don't get caught in that if you're the person with the Keykeeper, and also look out for those spots where you might want to do that with the anti-flash yourself. Tap your own things. And that's gonna do it. Yeah, thanks so much for listening and watching. Very soon, I think probably next week, we'll be doing the second state of the format address, just the rechecking on the format, what the meta is like. I mentioned earlier, as we did the first state of the format address at the beginning of the set, that I would be doing a second one for the set just to see what the state of the format is, 5 weeks, 6 weeks in. OTJ is not with us for too much longer. Modern Horizons 3, which is going to be the main draft set for the summer, that's, previews are starting. They're going to be done by the end of May. So, yeah, we don't actually have that much time with OTJ left, and gonna, of course, be talking about it a little bit more still. But thanks for watching and listening, everybody. We'll see you later.